بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله انتجبه لولايته واختصه برسالته وأكرمه بالنبوة وأشهد أن عليا ولي الله وأمينه في أرضه وهجته على عباده اللهم صل وسلم على محمد وآله الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين أوصيكم عباد الله وإياي بتقوى الله. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Before I begin today's sermon, it becomes a necessity for me to admonish myself and remind myself to adhere to the precepts and the disciplines of taqwa, and of course, by extension, advise you, each and every one of you, to adhere to the disciplines of taqwa. For indeed, taqwa is the spiritual state of the human being, and the benefits for it manifests in this world as well as in the hereafter, especially when our time has come up and we are carried and we are then placed within the graves. The darkness that surrounds us, it is taqwa and our good deeds, our ilm and amalun salih, which will provide light for us. It will provide a way for us and guide us through the world of uncertainty. It will help us in alim al-barzakh, and of course in the final day, in the different events that will transpire on the day of judgment. And of course, when we turn to the Holy Quran, you find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in many verses speaks about the qualities of taqwa and the importance to adhere to the disciplines of taqwa. Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu taqullaha wa kunu ma'as sadiqeen. O you who believe, adhere to the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Be conscious of His existence wherever you are, whether you are in your homes, whether you are in your workplaces. Make sure that your mind never forgets Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and never render yourself to that state of heedlessness. And of course, after that, He says, وَكُونُوا مَعَ الصَّادِقِينَ, and be amongst those who are truthful, those who are the representations of truth, who are the embodiment of truth. And of course, they are none except the Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. When we speak about the qualities of taqwa, the Quran, what it does in certain verses, highlights certain actions and attributes which go against the values of taqwa. And one of them being hatred. Hatred is an emotion, it is a vice. Hatred and animosity, enmity, is a vice, a spiritual vice which harbors in the heart of the human being. And naturally, it repulses a person to have such qualities. When you come across a person who harbors hatred in his heart, you will be repulsed by him. You'll deter yourself from such individuals. In contrast to a person who loves and a person who shows empathy, a person who is always giving, we are naturally attracted to such personalities. And when you look at the element and the concept of hatred, hatred in one way or another blinds people. It creates a fog which blocks the aql and the thinking capacity of such individuals. The intelligent or the power of intelligence and the aql is regressed in the soul of the person, or is regressed in a person who harbors hatred in their hearts. Now, when you look at our communities specifically, for example, leave aside societies, leave aside other communities. Let's talk about our communities. When you have two believers and there is a conflict or a disagreement between these two individuals, naturally you'll find that after the conflict is over, after there is a resolvement between these two individuals, there is still some level or to some degree hatred or animosity which resides in the heart. Now this emotion, this feeling has to be cleared, it has to be let out. But if you find that unfortunately if there is a lack of communication between these two individuals, then this feeling will continue to be maintained within the heart. And when it is there in the heart, it begins to grow and it becomes stronger. And it becomes like a curtain of darkness which blocks the eyesight of the heart. And when such feelings become stronger, they fester and they turn into anger and they turn into hatred. At the end, you find that this hurts both the person who harbors such feelings and, of course, the person who it is directed towards. And naturally, what happens is that it begins to break and it begins to dissolve the fabrics of society. If you imagine many people who harbor hatred and animosity towards one another, such a community will not have the opportunity to grow and become stronger, not physically nor spiritually. Imam Ali alayhi salam beautifully mentions in a hadith, and it's a strikingly beautiful hadith. He says, if I was to strike a person on his nose in such a way that it hurts him, it brings about pain, if it is a believer, he will never hate me. He says, on the other hand, if I was to give a munafiq the values of the world, the riches and the jewels of the world, and make him abundantly rich or richer than what he is now, for the munafiq, he will never love me. So when you come towards the concept of love and hate, you'll find that there is an Islamic position to it. But what's interesting is that scholars, when they speak about love and hate, it is a concept that should be directed towards, it is a feeling and emotion that should be directed towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And many a times, love and hate is not something that should be directed or personally acted upon within our lives. Yes, there is room for love and hate within our own personal lives, but more so it should be directed towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there's a beautiful hadith mentioned by the infallible alayhi salam. He says, كُلُّ مَنْ لَمْ يُحِبْ عَلَى الدِّينِ فَلَمْ وَلَمْ يُبْغَدْ عَلَى الدِّينِ فَلَا دِينَ لَهُ. He says, whoever or anyone who does not love based on the standards of religion and does not hate based on the standards of religion, there is no religion for the human being. Tawalla and tabarra, as it is known, and of course we are more familiar with the term tawalla and tabarra, love and hate for the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam, is part and parcel of the religion of Islam. We love who the Ahl al-Bayt love, we love for their sake, and we hate who they hate. We hate who for the sake of the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam. And these are of course part of the furu'id-din, it is part of the makeup of the religion of Islam. So although hate is a fundamentally strong emotion, something that we all deter from and hate naturally, we hate, you find that it does have a place in the religion of Islam only when it is directed towards the message of Islam, towards the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam. We love for their sake and we hate who they hate. And this is something that is profoundly repeated in many of the ziyarats when we speak to the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam themselves. What's fundamentally also important for us to understand is that hatred is an emotion which does not stem or grow overnight. It's not something that develops overnight. It's something that develops over a long period of time. It develops slowly, like a tree. A tree in its initial stages is weak, it's fragile. A seed is weak and it's fragile. But when it's nurtured under the right environment and the right temperatures, when water is given, it begins to grow. The more it grows over the years, the stronger it becomes. It becomes firmly rooted within the ground, and it becomes stronger and stronger over the years, until it becomes very difficult to get rid of it. It becomes difficult to uproot this tree, if there is a need to uproot the tree in the first place. But if there is a need to uproot the tree, it's better to obviously do so when the tree is in its preliminary stages. It's the same procedure when it comes to anger or jealousy or any of the spiritual vices that we have within our hearts, and amongst them hatred and enmity and animosity. In its beginning stages, it's very easy to pinpoint that this is an emotion of hatred. Let's remove it from our hearts, rather than letting it harbor for many years until it becomes very difficult to then remove it. Unfortunately, you find that if many people are not cognizant or even aware or understand that they harbor hatred in their hearts, then as it grows over the years, it becomes part and parcel of their character. It becomes part and parcel of their personality, to the extent that it naturally, their actions, their words naturally embody hatred and animosity. At that time, of course, even they realize that they have a problem, and because they have habituated themselves to act out in hatred and animosity, it becomes hard for them to seek change. When you look at, for example, the seerah of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, and these are the days of the Holy Prophet of Islam, considering that we've just marked his wilada a few days ago, you find that in his time, in the beginning stages of his risala, of his tabligh, of his da'wah, there were many Muslims who were targeted and they were persecuted. The persecution, they were humiliated, they were targeted, they were hunted. For which reason? It was the hatred that they had within their hearts. Now, this is a beautiful discussion in itself, but to keep it brief, you'll find that throughout years or throughout generations and throughout history, we've realized or we've come to an understanding that hatred, at times it can come from an individual, but at times it can be something that emanates from the leaders of societies and leaders of certain countries. That leaders are to blame for spewing hatred into the hearts of their followers. And this is surprisingly something that has existed since the very beginning of time, especially if the leaders are despots, if the leaders are dictators, and those who oppress their own citizens. You find that these individuals, in order to accumulate power, in order to accumulate loyalty and support, they will harbor hatred, they will spew and, of course, allow people to be, they will increase the hatred that exists in the hearts of their followers. Now, in the time of the Holy Prophet of Islam, when you look at the Quraysh of Mecca, they persecuted the Muslims purely because they hated the Muslims. They hated the movement of Islam. And so the Muslims naturally, in one point or another, had to migrate towards the lands of Abyssinia, where the king was a much more flexible king, much more learned, much more free in showing and expressing love compared to hatred. Beyond the time of the Holy Prophet of Islam, you find, for example, when the Bani Umayyah came into power, Al Abi Sufyan or Al Marwan, and beyond them the Bani Abbas, many of their policies were based on hate. It was based on enmity and animosity, and most of it was vented towards the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam and towards the followers of the Ahl al-Bayt alayhim salam. Forget history. If you look at what's happening currently today in the world, you find the same principles being repeated. Leaders of the world spew hatred. They target certain minorities, from amongst them the Muslims, from amongst them people from different races, the Shias, and so on and so forth. Hate is directed towards people who are different compared to the leaders of these certain countries. If you look at what's happening in America today, the elections, 2020 elections, surprisingly, when you look at the tenure of Donald Trump over the past 4 years, this is a man who is the embodiment of hatred. From the very beginning, he spewed lies, he spewed hatred into the hearts of his followers and allowed this feeling to nurture and grow over the 4 years. When you look at some of his policies, in, for example, building the wall, or when it comes to his feelings when it came towards families migrating towards the US and separating children and toddlers and infants from their families and their mothers and fathers, all of these policies were based on hatred. It was based on the animosity he had towards those who were different from him. When it came towards the Muslim ban, when it came to many of his different policies, it was all based and fundamentally pivoted on hatred and animosity. Now, what's surprising in this day and age right now, and I think many Americans have come to this realization, and in fact, beyond that, the world has come to the realization that at least 70 million people voted for him to continue his term as the President of the United States. 70 million approximately. That is approximately 50%, roughly 50% of the voting population. That's remarkably high. This is a man who has spewed hatred. This is a man who has represented hatred for the past 4 years. And it is shocking that he received this amount of votes from the American citizens themselves. As in, you would think that this is a man who was exposed to be a hate monger, yet you find that 50% or approximately 50% of the voting population resonate his ideas, they follow his ideas, and they are very happy for him to continue for the next 4 years. That is remarkably shocking. And we realize, as non-Americans, we realize that America has a deeper problem. And that problem is that many people harbor hatred in their hearts. Many people see it as an emotion that is part and parcel of their lives, and they see nothing wrong in it, in whatsoever. Look what the ayah of the Holy Quran says. The ayah of the Holy Quran says, Ya ayyuhan nas innama baghyukum ala anfusikum. It says, O mankind, your violations, when you transgress, when you act out in aggression, your violations are to your own detriment. A very beautiful verse. And the verse, what it does is it highlights the spirituality. It speaks to the nafs of the human being, addressing to the whole of humanity as a whole. It says, listen to what we have to say. Do you not realize that your violations, that your wrongdoings will one day come back to you and hurt you? The qaida, the rule, what goes around comes around. This is, according to the tafsir of Allama Tabatabai Al-Mizan, beautiful words. He says, "Innama baghyukum." The word baghi. What's the meaning of the word baghi? Baghi means to seek out, to gain something, to get something, to expose something. It says that the word baghi is often used as transgression and oppression. The reason is because you're seeking out the rights of others. You want to expose the rights of others just so that you can trample on them and violate those rights. And this is something often referred to as oppressors, as transgressors, people who act out in aggression. And what the verse explains is that when you trample on the rights of others, one day your rights will be trampled on. One day what you did to others will come back and haunt you before you leave this world. And the reason why that is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created every single human being and has made them all part of a system. And He has linked each and every one of us to be a part of this system. When we trespass, when we transgress the boundaries, it has an effect on the whole. Because remember, we're all linked with one another. An oppressor who acts out in transgression and aggression and oppression, what happens is that because he is a part of this whole system that Allah has created, because he is linked with this entire system, when the system begins to malfunction, when an imbalance is created, he also is affected in one way or another. Temporarily, he will see his riches grow, he will see his power dominate, he will see his authority being unquestioned. But then sooner or later, because he is affected, he will see the effects of his actions. In the world today, when we see, for example, an imbalance, it is because on the global scale, you find that there are people who transgress the rights of others. They do not consider the rights of others. It is because they do not see the future or the rights of the future generations. They are actively part of the mess that they have created or the mess that has been created. And the consequences can be seen on a global level as well. In all aspects of life, you find, for example, there is a decrement in physical health. Mental health is a rising concern. There is economic inequality. There is environmental pollution, global warming, social dysfunctions. All of these chaoses are a byproduct of the imbalance that has been created within the system as a whole. Now, I as a believer, forget the leaders of the communities and societies, I as a believer in my ordinary life, if I harbor hatred in my heart, what is it that I should do? وَلَا تَجْعَلْ فِي قُلُوبِنَا غَلَّةً لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا رَبَّنَا إِنَّكَ رَؤُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ. I turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first and foremost and I say, Ya Allah, I beg and I ask that you remove any negative feelings that I have in my heart towards the believers first and foremost, because we have a lot in common. there are profoundly many elements that we as believers have in common. If there is hatred and animosity between us, Ya Allah, I ask that you remove these feelings and these elements and these spiritual vices from my heart. And then beyond that, to my neighbors, to the people in my community, to the people in my city, and of course to the people in my in the global community as well. This is a necessary part of self-building, a process that has to be that is fundamentally required to move and to progress towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ghil is very subtle. It's undetected movement. It begins to grow within my heart without even me being aware of it. It remains hidden and it remains undiscovered. But if it's harbored for too long, over many years, it becomes, or it manifests in my words and it manifests in my angers. So as believers, we need to be aware of the dangers of harboring negativity and hatred within our hearts and to seek safety from it. And there are certain ways to do so. One of them is to always be alert of our emotions and to recognize, or to be able to recognize the disease. If there are people in our families who recognize such behaviors, we should take that on board and try and create change from the very beginning, before it becomes too late, before it becomes part of our character and personalities. Number two, inspire yourselves or ourselves with the teachings and the examples of virtuous personalities. Amongst them, the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. The Ahlul Bayt, we should constantly remind ourselves the stories of how they used to behave when they were victims of hatred and animosity. When they had power, did they, for example, reciprocate that same level of hatred and animosity? Or did they reciprocate with love and mercy? And number three, to understand and to empathize with the people around us. That people have their lives, they have their problems, they may not have solutions to their problems, but we should all be cognizant of this and behave with them with empathy. And the idea behind all of this is to return back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a pure heart, qalb salim. And there is no space for hatred, there is no place for hatred in a heart which is pure, in a heart which is free from all negativity. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى اللهم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.